Three themes I just want to touch on. Linda Everman has been working for a decade or more on getting a semi-postal stamp for Alzheimer's, and they announced yesterday that we're going to have a semi-postal stamp for Alzheimer's. Kathy Siggins and Linda Everman were partners in that effort. These are two citizens affected by Alzheimer's, and demonstrated that with persistence and the right arguments, you can move mountains. Second is the notion that we are partnering now with an increasing number of local organizations. You heard from Southern California, but also New York and in Mississippi. But we're partnering with increasing number of local organizations to make sure that we can actually act on the ground as well as here in Washington. So we are their voice here, they are our voice there. And finally, intergenerational. We've got a high school student who is driving high school students into this, and of course, the Farrell family itself is intergenerational in the fight against this disease. So the notion that somehow this is an old person's disease, no. We now know that it starts in midlife, and two, the caregivers and the family impact is affecting every generation. So it's not an old person's disease, it is a family disease and every generation. So I'm very excited. Next panel is got some of my favorite people on it. So this is the path to 2025. You heard a mention of the fact that we have a national goal to find a means of prevention and effective treatment by 2025. And we're going to hear now from both the government and industry on where we are on that path.
Well, join me in welcoming an amazing panel that will explore with us over the next hour where we are on reaching the goal that George just mentioned, and that is our nation boldly set a goal through the National Alzheimer's Project Act, and it was set by the Advisory Council. And I recall when this goal was set, and I recall that George Vredenberg had a decided finger on the pressure button for the HHS, the Health and Human Services, to set a goal. And it's one of the first times that in many, many decades of working in policy that I've seen such a bold goal set by the federal government. The panel we have today is going to look at where we are in reaching that goal, and we couldn't have a better panel. To my right is Dr. Billy Dunn. Billy leads the neurology division within the Center for Drug Review and Research at the FDA. No treatment will get to a patient in this country unless he puts the okay with the check mark at the top of the application.
A little more than a check mark.
Next to him is Samantha Budd Haberlein, who runs the clinical development program at Biogen in neuroscience. She represents the best and the brightest of a generation of researchers within pharma dedicated to make a change in all of our lives. She'll speak for herself, but she speaks as a representative of so many passionate people working in industry. Next to her is Dr. Eliezer Maslia, who came in this last year and heads the neurology group at the National Institute on Aging. And he too is responsible for working with the National Institute on Aging and making sure that every increased federal dollar devoted to Alzheimer's is put to its best use to reach the 2025 goal. And finally, at the very end, we have Dr. David Morgan, who is the president and that leads our Researchers Against Alzheimer's, over 400 researchers in the nation, taking the funding that is given to them or made available to them and putting it to the best use. So you can see the sort of relay race that's here between the federal government funding research, the research community picking up the baton, doing its best, handing the best ideas over to industry to develop, and then bringing those to the FDA for an open and aggressive and supportive review and delivery. So we're going to look in the next 45 minutes at where we are, the confidence you each have that we will reach the 2025 goal. What are the obstacles that you foresee in reaching the 2025 goal? What are the things that you've seen that encourage you the most? How are we applying our federal resources? And how are our clinical trial systems working? Where are the pressure points, the inflection points? And are we going to get there? So let's begin. I would like to first begin with you, Dr. Meslia, at the very beginning of this food chain. When you look at the federal government and the increased funding it has been given, and the increased funding that this audience is going to be asking for tomorrow on the Hill, what are you most proud of? Let's begin there, and then we'll come back to what you see as the greatest obstacle in the second round of questions. But let's begin with what are you most proud of that we've accomplished?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be here, and really congratulate you for the phenomenal work that you all are doing. And again, as you said, I mean, this is an effort between private industry, government, the society to beat this terrible disease. So again, thank you for inviting me. I came to NIH about a year ago, and thanks to all your efforts, our budget for research for Alzheimer's disease has triplicated. We went from about 500 to 600 million a year ago to now about 1.4 billion, and I know that you guys are fighting for an additional 400 million, so we'll be at a total of 1.8 billion. So this is really extraordinary. I mean, I say this is a golden era in Alzheimer's disease in terms of funding. So what is happening with this money? Well, this increased funding occurred, as I said, about a year ago, so it's somewhat premature to say what the achievements will be, but I think that we're well in place toward the 2025 goal. If I would have to choose one program, well, you know, we haven't reached a number of different programs, going from the very basic science of Alzheimer's disease to what is in between basic science and clinical, which is the preclinical aspects, and then the clinical aspects of Alzheimer's disease moving to clinical trials. But if I would have to focus on one, I think that one of the major breakthroughs and contributions that have occurred primarily through funding through NIH is the development of biomarkers for early diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. This has led, in combination also with a very large program that we have that is called Alzheimer's Disease Sequencing Program, which basically is trying to understand the genetic underpinnings of Alzheimer's disease. This, in combination with the Biomarkers program that we call ADNI, or Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, had led to the very early diagnosis and detection of Alzheimer's disease, and this in turn could lead to the development of what we call prevention clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease. As you will hear more from my colleagues, which are experts on that area. Many of the clinical trials that have happened for Alzheimer's disease till this point have been mostly in persons with advanced stages of the disease, and the reason for that is because we really didn't have the tools for early detection. Well, now we have those tools. We understand better the genetics, so we can combine that and now start designing clinical trials in individuals before the clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's disease occur. So I think this is a major, major breakthrough, and we'll see the result of some of these clinical trials in the next few years, and that's really gonna mark the rhythm as to how fast or what else we need to do to get to that goal of 2025. But really, it's extraordinary what's going on.
And you're going to feel this message of hope and the power of this research engine, and we all need that. We heard in the last panel that the economic devastation that we face as a nation, maybe the only hope is going to be a research breakthrough. So, Dr. Morgan, you published through the Researchers Against Alzheimer's, and I think there may be a mic behind your chair. Just saying.
It was really on the chair. I didn't grab it.
It's a far better place now. You do a pipeline report every year. You look at what's coming down the pipeline, and I'd like to have you reflect on the research community's view of what's most exciting that's occurred.
Well, there's been a number of things that have happened in the last year in terms of basic scientific understanding of what's happening in Alzheimer's. But one of the ones that I found most surprising and actually I think fundamentally will give us new approaches to treating this disease is to understand for the first time at the atomic level how amyloid and tau are stuck together. So without getting too deep into the science, we know that amyloid is made up out of a protein that we call the A-beta peptide, and it aggregates into a polymer. And we know that tau also is a protein that can aggregate into a polymer. And when they aggregate, we never really understood exactly how these different molecules were stuck together. We didn't understand what actually brought them together. But there's a new technique called Cryo-Electron Microscopy. Now, I realize this sounds like an experiment at the South Pole, but what it really is a new technique that permits us to understand how the individual components of each protein at the atomic level are stuck together. What this permits us then to do is use computers to help us design molecules to disrupt that structure. And if we can dissolve the amyloid plaques and we can dissolve the tau tangles, that we think is going to be a fundamentally different way of approaching and treating this disease. So I think this is a breakthrough of sorts. Will probably take 5 years before we see a trickle-down impact of this on the drugs that we're using to treat the disease. But I think these are the types of things that we're discovering on a routine basis that will give us the tools to prevent and treat Alzheimer's by 2025.
You know, incidentally, the researchers that invented the cryo-EM received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry this morning. Yeah,
Oh my goodness.
So I guess
that's perfect.
That's amazing.
that's good confirmation of my perspective.
You smart, David. Well, speaking of a trickle-down discovery that comes to industry, I'm going to go to Samantha Budd-Haberlein next. How do you take what you hear here and what you've been given, and how do you turn it into something that you're going to bring to Dr. Dunn in hopes that it goes to this community?
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. So I'd like to comment that it's been published that it takes about 20 years from unraveling principal components of biology until a new drug reaches patients, on average, 20 years. And for at least 20 years, multiple industry partners have worked tirelessly on the one task that we focus on, which is to bring new therapeutics for diseases that don't have them. And in Alzheimer's disease, a therapeutic to stop or slow that disease is what we have solely been focused on. I am optimistic because today we and other industry partners have multiple programs in the final stages of clinical testing that I do have a great deal of hope around. So we have anti-amyloid approaches, both antibodies and small molecules, beta-secretase inhibitors. We also have programs addressing the tau pathology. So there are multiple programs that have engineered or designed new molecules that have worked with advanced clinical trial designs, including over a decade. We have been using amyloid imaging to include patients in clinical trials. So we're in a very good position today. But as to where industry is in that ecosystem, in Biogen, if we take the tau antibodies and aducanumab, which is our program in phase 3 for amyloid, they were both discovered in an academic setting, in a group in Switzerland. And they were both brought into Biogen in their discovery phases. And then that's where industry really applies what it is extremely good at, the engineering aspects of turning that idea into a drug. And there are many things required for that to happen. But that's how we collaborate from academia. Another way is there is a lot of science inside of industry. If we look at beta secretase inhibitors, small molecules, the enzyme was cloned jointly by academia and industry back in 1999. And then industry applied its unique chemistry approaches with teams of upwards of 50 chemists for more than a decade to find molecules that were safe and effective for human use. So that's the piece of the ecosystem that we have. And then ultimately, in collaboration with our regulatory partners, we discuss the best way to see if these medicines are effective in patients and if they therefore should progress to marketing authorizations.
Well, you clearly were thinking of the next question then. What does that collaboration look like? In collaboration with our regulatory partners, how do you pick up the last part of this baton and hope? And I know there are no promises, but hope you see something that is not only safe, but is going to make a difference in patients' lives.
Right. Thank you. I like your analogy of the baton, and I think it really dovetails very nicely with what everybody else in the panel has said, and that we all play a role. I think the subtext of this introductory set of comments was to try to find accomplishments that we've made in the space. And as I think I told you before the panel, I would find that indecorous to celebrate, an accomplishment of the agency, because really the way I see it is exactly as we've all discussed it here. We're part of a team, and I tell my staff that we all exist on one team, playing roles together, and I think you've heard a very nice illustration of that. If anything, the folks that spoke are too humble about their roles on that team, and I'm very proud of that. So in terms of an accomplishment, I think that we do not sit passively waiting. We often say that we can only deal with what is brought to us by our industry colleagues, but we don't just sit passively waiting for that to arrive. We are vibrant members of that team. I'd like to think that we're vibrant. You can ask my colleagues here. We're out there. We're engaged. The three of us were at a meeting on Alzheimer's just last week, a different meeting, and had an opportunity to discuss some of the things we'll be discussing today. So I'm extremely proud of that. I am very aggressive about ensuring that my staff, that we're out there, that we're engaged, that we're constantly trying to explore ways to bring innovative approaches to therapeutic development, therapeutic assessment, and really speed the efficiency of our development. So that's to me something that's absolutely crucial, is that the agency is recognized as a partner in this, and those are the words that I think you heard here as well.
So the 2025 goal, to restate it very clearly, is to prevent or treat and effectively treat. See, I knew. To prevent and effectively treat Alzheimer's by 2025. That is the goal, no equivocation. What keeps each of you up at night about whether we're going to make that goal? And I think I'll go back in the same order just for some symmetry here. So, Dr. Eliezer, you will have, we hope, $1.8 billion. Your director has written in a recent blog that he needs $2 billion to reach the 2025 goal going into 2019. Is it a question of money? Is that what keeps you up at night? Or is it something else? What is your biggest concern about whether we'll make this relay race and get the win?
As we move along, I think we have learned a tremendous deal about how to move forward. Of course, it's always a concern when a new clinical trial is announced and negative results are announced. I mean, that always is a concern, but I think that we have learned a tremendous deal, and as I mentioned before, we have now learned that what we need to do is to go earlier and earlier, and to the stage where we can identify the disease before clinical symptoms begin, and then start treating. And again, we don't know if that's actually going to work or not, but that's in the direction in which we're going. But to get to that goal and to achieve that, I think that there are a number of barriers that we need to pass through. One of them, of course, we're learning that the disease is quite complex and heterogeneous and is somewhat different in each person, and that eventually probably we'll have to develop therapeutics that are, as now they are called, personalized therapeutics. So we need to understand better the genetics of each individual with Alzheimer's disease to try to model the therapeutic for that person. So that is a big headache, and that's quite complex.
Like in cancer.
Yeah, like in cancer, for example. The other one is we're going to start discovering a number of other targets. For example, we have a program that is called Accelerated Medicines Program for Alzheimer's Disease that is trying to identify new targets for Alzheimer's disease in addition to the ones that Dave mentioned already, amyloid beta and tau. We're trying to find novel targets. So we're going to have a number of different targets that are going to have to be tested in a number of different conditions and individuals, different genetic underpinnings. So we're going to need a number of volunteers for these trials. So one thing that keeps us awake at night is thinking, well, how are we going to do to recruit all these people? And we're going to have also individuals of diverse backgrounds, diverse ethnic backgrounds, etc., for these clinical trials. So how are we going to achieve that? So NIA, in collaboration with you and with other associations, FDA, etc., we initiated an effort toward improving recruitment for clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease, and you probably will hear about the progress. Several individuals here have contributed tremendously to that effort, and the results of this effort will make publicly available and for public comment. So again, it's something that you'll have an opportunity to talk about. But I think those issues, the heterogeneity of the disease, the need for personalized medicine, recruitment for clinical trials, and then having diverse populations represented in those studies are things that are quite critical. And again, we're working pretty hard and keeps us awake at night. But I think we're making progress with everybody's help here.
Dr. Morgan.
I want to echo what he just said. I think it used to be money was our most acute need. As a research scientist, when you have to be in the top 10% of all of the grants to get funded, it becomes very discouraging to send in 9 grants hoping to get 1. And as a result of that, it was a big problem. But now we're starting to overcome that, in part because of your help in making this a big issue at the legislative level and having all this. So I'd just like to have an applause for you folks getting rid of that problem. But the next problem is we need to take the ideas that people like me are developing in the labs and move them into the clinical realm. And we've got a big problem there. You heard John Dwyer earlier today about GAP, about how long it takes to enroll in a clinical trial. And I didn't for a long time understand why. Because I go, okay, we got 5 million people. Okay, John says we got 100 trials. Let's say there's 1,000 people per trial. That's 100,000 people. That's 2%. We've only got 2% of the people with Alzheimer's in a clinical trial. Why is that? Well, part of the reason is we're not even diagnosing the disease. I run a community-based memory screening program at 55 and older communities in Florida. And what we're finding is community residing older adults come in, 20 to 40% of the people who come for a screening score at a level we would consider them to be impaired, and we recommend they go and get a diagnosis. They say, where should I go? We don't know. We don't have the medical resources to make the diagnosis that you need to get into a clinical trial. The median MMSE, the median score that someone gets in cognitive impairment is too low to get into the majority of trials that we're running today when you're diagnosed. And so these are very important issues that, even though I'm a molecular neuroscientist, I can see from having come to meetings like this and listened to the industry people, these are the things we need to overcome. I also happen to be directing a clinic for Alzheimer's disease. And we lose money with every patient we see. We need to find more efficient ways to evaluate and diagnose this disease, and then we can get these people involved in the clinical trials. And I think also learning to take the trials to where the people live rather than making them come to our academic medical centers may be another definite step that we can take to enhance that enrollment.
I don't know if Daisy Duarte, raise your hand where you are, but we know that out here bringing the trial to where the patient is has made a difference in lives, and we'll come back to this, Mr. Taylor. But you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that. I think those are some excellent points, and one of the things I wanted to say is you're going to hear some themes. And in some ways, after Eliezer, after your initial comments, I think it's really, well, let's wrap up the panel there. You summed everything up so well. But we're gonna repeat a lot of these themes, and I think we're going to be echoing each other. And one of the things you heard just now was about recruitment and how difficult it can be, and how that's a small number, their scores may be too low. And this brings up the issue of a contemporary understanding of the disease, and we'll probably talk about this more later, but this is something that I and Dr. Bud Haberlein, amongst many others, are very involved in, and this notion of pushing our understanding of the disease and how we conceptualize of the disease. Alzheimer's provides us an opportunity. It's a horrible disease, but we have a tremendous opportunity in a window that allows us to diagnose people in a modern way, in a way that's based upon pathophysiological changes associated with the disease. We have an opportunity to make that definitive diagnosis, identify those pre-symptomatic patients that will have that condition, and evaluate them. And we have to work on that and leverage that. And that will help us not arrive too late, not have people with scores too low. Because as we've heard, once you're at that point, you're not early in the disease. George, I think you made this point. You're not early in the disease at all.
How
You're late
do
in the
you
disease.
diagnose somebody that is preclinical, no symptoms, but clearly has this new contextual view of the disease?
Right. I think the other panel members may want to speak to this as well, and I don't mean to derail the conversation, but what we are increasingly having the ability to do is use sophisticated testing. Dr. Bud Haberlein mentioned the use of that testing in clinical trial settings previously. It's been going on for about 10 years. It's very unusual for us now to have an Alzheimer's trial that doesn't have this testing included. But we have the ability to use sophisticated testing to detect the pathophysiological changes associated with the disease that, as we evolve our understanding, will come to be diagnostic of the disease. And we can use those tests to then diagnose Alzheimer's disease before it is symptomatic.
One of the things I think George and others will wrap up with is the advocacy that this group will do for just this sort of thing. The need that you don't have to be in the clinical trial in order to know if you have an early presentation of Alzheimer's. You need to be finding that out in the context of your clinical care, or we're not going to get the legions of people coming down the pipeline. So talk to this, continue this, please.
Right, we'll probably get into that later, but this notion of integrating clinical care into our research endeavors and leveraging the knowledge that we have that's latent out there is absolutely key. I'm confident we'll talk about that more later in the panel, but I completely concur with that. It's impossible for our clinical trial infrastructure, as it's been conventionally envisaged, to take advantage of this explosive uptick in knowledge and scientific knowledge. We have to do a better job providing opportunities to study that.
So this builds completely on the point I was going to make, Deborah, that we're ahead of the curve in clinical research and clinical trials. We are already using those molecular diagnostics to accurately diagnose patients at earlier stages of disease. So back to your original question, 2025 is 7 years away. To find a treatment to be able to treat Alzheimer's disease means that something needs to complete a clinical trial and show efficacy within that period of time. Now, I have a degree of confidence that several programs in late clinical testing across industry have an opportunity to do that. So my concern switches then to whether patients will be able to have access to those treatments if they are successful. We have two issues here. We've just discussed diagnosis, accurate diagnosis at earlier stages of disease, that a patient is efficiently identified, funneled to an accurate diagnosis, and that to lead to treatment. That is clearly something that will need to change. And who is going to do that? There was a report this summer about the neurologist deserts, that could be appearing across the United States. There are 20 regions in the US defined as having a growing population of individuals with dementia, but a very low ratio of specialists, of neurologists who will be the front line of being able to diagnose those original treatments. So that points to a need for infrastructure, a need for education, and a need for changing clinical practice in Alzheimer's disease for those treatments to reach as many patients as possible.
You have an audience here that's taking what we say and wanting to turn it into policy action. So talking about a means of prevention and treating this disease without a means of access to prevention and treatment to that new means of treatment is something you're saying we can't have one without the other, that these are tied.
Well, I think it's, again, back to the theme. There's an ecosystem here. There are multiple parts of the ecosystem. We in industry, our part to bring forward a new therapeutic, we will work tirelessly to do that. But there are other parts of the ecosystem that I'm concerned we also need to come up to speed, and having access and all the pieces that lead to that one word access will be important to address.
Could you speak to infrastructure that we need? And just along the theme of what we're discussing, GAP is an effort to have a new clinical trial infrastructure that is high performance and shaves 2 years off clinical trial time. You're talking, Dr. Maslia, about a recruitment infrastructure that we need. Do we have the right support systems across the ecosystem so that you all can do what you need to do? That feeds into policy discussions, and I know we haven't really thought about this question, but you all have teed it up. Do you all have what you need to do your job if the most promising science is delivered across the transom?
Well, you know, I mean, we certainly going in the right direction.
Yeah, take care of that one.
Right. But and I mean, as we mentioned, we have developed a number of programs that extend from the very basic scientific aspects of the disease to the very advanced clinical trials. But one aspect that Samantha mentioned, and really it's extremely important, is expand the infrastructure in terms of training the next generation of neurologists, of healthcare specialists, social workers, etc., that are going to be taking care of this population. I mean, you're absolutely right. We had started to invest some of the new funds that we received toward increasing clinical training. Also, and this in part through a number of interactions with Congress and with others, we are now required to increase the number of early career investigators, new investigators into the field of Alzheimer's disease. And this is also very, very important. Actually, our funding for new investigators or early career investigators is now better than for senior investigators. Again, to stimulate new people jumping into the field. But the truth is, we do not have the critical mass right now in terms of physicians, researchers, et cetera. And we really need to accelerate and create that infrastructure in that particular area. I think it's an area that definitely, I totally agree with you. We need to invest more resources.
Other thoughts about the system surrounding the ecosystem where we all could take this back to important conversations about what we need to move the science forward? Yes.
Well, one thing, I think there are opportunities to try and take advantage of these problems. But I think one of the problems to begin with is that there's no money in Alzheimer's disease from a medical perspective. There really isn't, it isn't like replacing a knee. It isn't like a bypass surgery where there's a lot of funds that are used that come out of that initial diagnosis. What it is a condition where there's not a lot we can do for you. The physicians, this is not the sexiest area to go into when you come out of medical school. It really requires people who are really almost more social worker than physician to really want to do this. And I think we need to somehow find mechanisms to enhance those rewards for the people who decide to go into this type of a research specialization. But there are some things that I've noted that surprise me. So in the state of Florida, there are 15 state-supported memory disorders clinics scattered throughout the state. These are places that are subsidized by state funds in order to give a detailed diagnosis as to a cause of memory impairment. Only a third of those do anything related to clinical research. But you have 14,000 people being diagnosed every year in the state of Florida, the vast majority of which are never even offered the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial. And I think as we start to learn more and more about these, and we can find ways to take just some funds to hire clinical trial coordinators and put them into those sites to begin the recruitment process. I think there's probably a lot of places that we haven't quite organized things well enough, and having the funds to provide that upper level of organization, I think, can also help accelerate this entire process.
Let me shift to a couple of other areas that have been focuses of the last several years. And I want to raise two and ask you to speak to either one of them, and then we're going to ask for some questions from the audience. The first one is a new kind of clinical trial that will help us be more efficient, will help us get down this long and lengthy 20 years much faster. Dr. Woodcock recently said our clinical trial system is broken. Commissioner Gottlieb said the current course is unsustainable. And they have suggested new models for trials, seamless adaptive trials, trials with what we call master protocols. Are we doing this in Alzheimer's? How do we, and is Alzheimer's especially in need of a shortened, more efficient kind of clinical trial? And what would that look like where you can engage patients and caregivers more effectively, perhaps, in monitoring the outcomes in the trials and being more engaged? So that's the first area. And then I just used the word outcomes. How do you think about clinically meaningful outcomes so that we're sure that a treatment does, in fact, change something that is meaningful to the patient and the caregiver? And there I look at the new area of patient-focused drug development, and where might it go in Alzheimer's? So those are two big questions. They're related, but they're different, and I'd appreciate responses.
So if I could start, Deborah, perhaps we don't do enough advertising around the clinical trials that we have been doing recently. And to the question of are we innovating in clinical trials, I want to make sure that everybody knows that yes, we are. With speed in mind, with getting to patients efficiently in mind. If we take a look at two of the programs in late-stage clinical testing, we have beta-secretase inhibitors with Eli Lilly and Merck. Both of them went from a phase 1 to a 2-3 seamless. Large, seamless clinical trials. And those were, several years ago, those designs were discussed and agreed with regulators. We also have adaptive designs. We have Eisai's BAN 2401 in adaptive randomization and multiple interims all the way through the phase 2. We have several examples now of trials that have completely skipped a stage, understanding that we can replace a phase 2 by doing a properly designed phase 3, and understanding but embracing the risks that we take in doing that. So jumping from phase 1 to phase 3. So the sponsors, and again, our collaboration with regulators has supported us doing a number of truly innovative trial designs in Alzheimer's disease.
I'm glad you mentioned that. If you'll indulge me, I think that and I don't mind this, sometimes regulators can be an easy target, and that's fine. My skin is as thick as they come, and it's appropriate to do that sometimes because we're all frustrated, and we know that we have that checkbox, and everybody wants us to check that box. But I'm really eager to hear you, I'm happy to hear what you said. I'm eager to hear more about those who would assert that regulatory issues are an obstacle, I would ask you to comment in more detail on that, not only from your own perspective, but you also mentioned your colleagues with other companies who develop these products. I agree with you. I think we've been very innovative, and I think we've been very receptive to those things. And I think that those who suggest otherwise, that we are somehow hindering that, are really underinformed. But I'd like to hear what you think about that.
Well, I think underinformed is our own fault, Billy, because we often don't talk about these things. We're not very open about the conversations that we have. So, just to set the record straight a little bit, and, you might not know that at any time, even before we're in a clinical trial, we can reach out to regulators, we can reach out to the FDA and ask for their feedback at any time. We use that opportunity wisely, sagely, because we don't want to waste their time. But if there is a scientific question that we need to have a regulatory or a scientific question, consider the safety profile, consider the endpoints, consider the size of a clinical trial or the duration. Those are things that we will ask for feedback on. We can do it at any time. We tend to do it at key milestones. So if we're going into phase 1, at the end of phase 1, before a phase 3. So there are these prescribed times that we have those conversations, but there's always an open door for, at any time, if we need to discuss something, we can make contact and we can have that conversation. So, Billy, you and I have had those conversations on numerous programs, you, me, your team, my team. That's how we've achieved a common understanding of being able to take what has emerged from the emerging science to your team and saying, well, hey, we believe, for example, this endpoint might be more appropriate for this patient population. And we've certainly been through that. Today, our clinical trials are almost overwhelmingly in much earlier stages of disease. And that has required us to consider what is the most appropriate endpoint for that given stage of disease. And to be comforted that that viewpoint, that scientific viewpoint, is shared and supported by our regulators, we go and have that conversation. And we've been doing that for years, and that movement of the science by industry in collaboration with regulators, US and globally, has been occurring and continues to occur.
It's encouraging.
Yeah, I'm delighted to hear that, and I certainly share that perspective. I think that type of interchange that we have is very valuable, and it occurs not only in those formal situations, but in multiple informal situations as well. We're here today. It comes back to my opening comments about how important it is to me that we are all scientists, part of a larger community working on this issue. And you just have 2 representatives here, but just these 2 representatives amongst the 4 of us, when I'm referring to industry and regulators, we work together on multiple informal things as well. We cross paths at many meetings, many panel sessions, many scientific discussions. So there's so much opportunity for this constant evolution of our thinking and consideration of the issues that arise as we design new trials, as we contemplate new scientific evidence that comes from our translational partners, our basic science partners. We truly are one team, and I think that's very important to keep in mind.
Well, and Eliezer, you were going to say something, I think, but this, as we move into the preclinical and the asymptomatic individuals, and we have to identify endpoints that show a change and or a positive, what will those look like in the person with no symptoms? What will we be looking for?
Yeah, this is absolutely a critical issue, and what we have learned in the past few years is that this is mostly what we call, or I was referring earlier today as biomarkers. Essentially, we're now able to detect, for example, the accumulation of amyloid beta protein, tau, or other types of injury in the brain by using brain scans, or by, for example, utilizing the spinal fluid, a spinal tap, and then analyzing that spinal tap and detecting some of these proteins involved in the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease, and changes both in the brain scan as well as biochemical changes in the spinal tap, or even possibly blood, are now possible to detect at a much earlier stage before the clinical symptoms begin. Now, what is really interesting here, and it really makes it completely different to any other disease that we have worked on. And I mean, I'm by training a pathologist, so I get to see all kinds of different diseases, at least when I was working at the clinic several years ago. And you know, we usually see the transition between the appearance of these markers of disease to the actual clinical symptoms of the disease relatively rapidly, right? For example, with an infectious disease, you'll see the clinical symptoms of the infection and the bacteria or the virus or what have you almost like at the same time. But for example, with cancer, well, maybe the very early biomarkers might be seen a year or two before the actual cancer tumor grows or spread through the body. With Alzheimer's, it's a totally different paradigm because now we're seeing these markers of the disease 20 to 30 years before the actual clinical onset of the disease. So that really it tells you a lot, and also tells you a lot about these clinical trials and endpoints and so on. So we're really going through a process right now of rethinking how do we define Alzheimer's disease. And again, this is an exercise that we're going through for research purposes. We haven't got really to the clinic, but this is something that eventually will go to the next level, and eventually will go to the clinic.
David, do you want one last comment? Then I want to open it for questions, so be ready.
So I think that, you know, the one question is,
James
will we
Taylor's.
get to the point that affecting the biomarker will be sufficient for approval for the drug? I know, for example, if you've got an anti-cholesterol drug, you don't need to demonstrate that it's reducing the risk of heart attacks. Blood pressure medications in somewhat the same way. But until we actually can demonstrate that one of the targets that we've chosen actually does impact the end stages of the disease, which is memory impairment, cognitive impairment, then I don't know that we will know that simply by itself is going to be sufficient. But I think once we reach that stage, and I'm very hopeful also, I mean, I think Samantha's right. We do have medications that if our science is correct, should work. And I think once that happens, then the whole process accelerates. Then it's not 2 years to do a study. Then it could be 6 months to do a study. And I think we'll see more and more graded improvements in our ability to treat once we get past that initial hurdle.
Yeah, that's such an important point, and it shows the circularity of all of these things that we're discussing. One of the comments we had in our pre-meeting was talking about obstacles. There is no greater obstacle, notwithstanding financial issues that we've previously encountered and that we're happy to see are being resolved now. There's no greater obstacle than achieving a fundamental understanding of the disease. That ties into everything. When we can get into the causative aspects of the disease and attack them, it allows our laboratories, our industry partners to design targeted therapies that will have a very high likelihood of succeeding because we will know what we're doing. We have example after example where a deep understanding of a disease, some of the biomarkers you mentioned in other disease states, leads to the ability to win. And here, although we have had a tremendous evolution of our knowledge, we need to continue to push that, because when we gain that understanding, as you say, it will just unleash the hounds and we will make rapid progress. That's true across many of our neurological conditions, and it's certainly true for Alzheimer's.
So I know James Taylor has a question, and then I see Mike Ellenbogen, and I see Lee Callahan, and I don't know everybody's name in the audience, so I'm going to stop there. But we want to begin with these questions very quickly. I think everybody will know that we're glad you're on this team, and we know you're on the same team, and it's very reassuring. So make the questions as quick as you can, and let's go in series. I think I said James, Mike, and then Lee Callahan, and then we'll get mics around.
Thanks the panel for an excellent discussion. I just wanted first a comment to remind it's not just policy, but also from the bottoms up, concern about recruiting individuals in trials. My wife and I have just started a program in Manhattan and across the state of Connecticut to get trial information in the office of every neurologist in the state of Connecticut and Manhattan, getting volunteers to help us reach out to each of those doctors. So if anybody lives in Manhattan or in Connecticut, we'd love to help you be feet on the ground for that program. And Dr. Miller reminded us this morning of how important it is to have people with the disease pushing the industry along. My wife and I, who has the disease, were trained by the Institute on Aging to be partners in the trial design process earlier this year. And I wondered if you thought that currently there are any people with the disease or care partners who are participating in this accelerated phase for new drugs, for new trials coming into the market, or if you think that the industry will be open to having people with the disease or care partners helping to design the trials.
So James, thank you very much for that important question. And you're absolutely right. Patients and their caregivers are the experts in disease. And anybody wanting to conduct a clinical trial wants to have expert input. We do seek expert input, including patient input to our clinical trials. We have our head of patient advocacy here at Us Against Alzheimer's is one of the groups that we learn more about patient needs and patient inputs. So we take this as a very important part of our design and consideration. So I'm happy that you elucidated that question.
Yeah, and I'm pleased to hear that question as well, because there's no question that that voice is crucial. We do work with our folks designing the trials to ensure that that's achieved, and I think it's no secret that patient-focused drug development is the term that we use, and it's something that's very important. It's been present at the agency for quite some time. We've always placed a great value on that, and it's been highlighted by its codification in several recent pieces of legislation, most recently the reauthorization of what we call PDUFA. And Deborah knows this as well as anybody, and that is a very important piece of what we do. We've held patient-focused drug development meetings in various disease states as a way to further our understanding of those diseases. That hasn't happened in Alzheimer's because we had to choose across many, many different disease states, but I actually am engaged with the AD PACE effort, which some of you I think know about, which is a very important, rigorously designed attempt to qualitatively and quantitatively assess patient preferences, patient needs, patient viewpoints that will then feed into, in a pre-competitive way, our ability to inform clinical trial design. So not only is the need there, I think the response to the need is present, and we are highly engaged in that area.
Thank you for that. Mike?
Time and time I hear that we have difficulties trying to get people into these clinical trials. And there's two things that I've noticed that I think industry needs to change. One, we need to get into telemedicine. And for one reason or another, I don't understand where the problems lie, whether it's at the federal level that we can't do this or whether it's pharma. But for some reason, nobody wants to go down that path. And it would be really helpful to caregivers because many of them can't be at these clinical trials. And the telemedicine, I mean, my wife has to go to these things, and it's 5 minutes worth of questions. Well, they can't take her at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock. She's got to leave at 11 o'clock. Well, that's her whole day shot from work. So that's one recommendation that I think you folks need to work on, if at all possible. The second thing I think is really important is when somebody's in a clinical trial, a lot of these clinical trials prevent you from going into another clinical trial at least 1 year. So there's got to be some modification to be made for those who are on the placebo that aren't actually getting the drug. Somehow they need to get something released to them early, even though the trial hasn't ended, to say, okay, you're free to go into another clinical trial. Because right now, I want to get in clinical trials. Nobody wants to take me because I got to wait a whole year. Well, a whole year may be too late.
So if I could take the first question. Michael, thank you. And this is exactly why patient input to our clinical trials is so important. If we take your first question around telemedicine and the fact that in Alzheimer's disease clinical trials, we increase our ability to understand the changes occurring with patients by including a care partner in those clinical trials. It's an incredibly important thing to do. But we are constantly challenging ourselves with respect to the time we are asking of both the individual in the trial and the study partner. I'm happy to say that in several of the trials that I run, we do have telephone calls as a component of removing visits for the patient and caregiver. We have assessed our ability to do that, and we are continually looking at every protocol to remove as many visits as possible. So I appreciate your question, and I want you to know that we are thinking about it and we are working at it. With regards to taking on a new treatment, maybe Billy, you could respond to that one.
Gee, thanks for the handoff. There's no question. I think that there's a broad aspect to what you said, which is a need for a revolution in how we approach our clinical trials in this space. As I said at the beginning, Alzheimer's provides an opportunity, and neurology, I'm a neurologist. Okay, that's what I do, and neurology provides Alzheimer's provides an opportunity for us to do a better job with our neurology trials. There's a huge patient population out there, obviously. There's increasing attention being paid to the population who may be at risk for this or who may be able to be diagnosed in a pre-symptomatic state. What we need to do is we need, as a community, a large scientific community, all of us who are scientists, all of us who are patients, all of us who are invested in advancing the scientific understanding of this condition and developing treatments for it, we need to own this space, and we need to ensure that in our routine clinical care that we have instituted clinical trial networks, innovative trial designs. We need to make the notion of participation in multiple research opportunities a fundamental core feature of our approach to the routine engagement with this disease. There have been other disease spaces that have done this, and I think that it can be extremely valuable for us to we can set up large networks. NIH can play a role in this. FDA can support this. Our industry partners can help with this. Our academic colleagues can be a part of this. Most importantly, the patients can be an important part of this. This will increase recruitment. It will increase efficiency. There's a lot of infrastructure to consider with that, but I think that if we take a revolutionary approach to how we recruit, enroll, and evaluate drugs in this condition, I think that we will win, and we will win much more rapidly than we would otherwise.
We have a couple. I know Dr. Callahan, I think you were next, right there. And then I don't know if we have, I know Greg O'Brien asked to be heard, and then I see and we have 5 minutes. I was just given so be brief, and let's see if we can get 3.
I just wanted to take the comments that you made about the complexity and the heterogeneity of disease and ask what the state of the science is in phenotyping Alzheimer's, and would some of the treatments that even have failed in the past, if they were targeted to a specific phenotype, be more successful?
Just very briefly, yeah, I think it's what we have learned is that actually the later the onset of Alzheimer's, the more heterogeneous the disease and confounding factors, comorbidities could appear. Probably the most prominent vascular disease, but also other pathologies that we see in other disorders, including, for example, Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal dementia, etc. So now we have a program that is a very comprehensive program that is looking across these heterogeneity of the disease and looking at different biomarkers, both blood, CSF, etc. So that's ongoing. But I think we could start with vascular, I think, which is the most obvious, and again, the overlap with diseases like Parkinson's disease, and move from there. And that's a path also for developing these combinatorial therapeutics, where not only you're targeting one thing like amyloid or tau, but also all other targets.
So we have one last question, I think, and then we've got to wrap. So Greg O'Brien.
Thank you. I have more of an encouragement than a question. I have to read this. I hope that's okay, but I'll be brief. First of all, I want to thank you for your heroic efforts. As George notes, Alzheimer's is not your grandfather's disease, it's a family disease. And yes, my grandfather died of Alzheimer's, as well as my mother, my father, and my uncle, and now it's come for me. You can count on all of us in this room to support your efforts, emotionally in public, ongoing lobbying, You know, we wish we could write a check. In my case, I have plenty of cash. It's just tied up in debt. That's a joke, you can laugh. But more to the point, many of us in this disease feel the train has left the station in spite of the best efforts to stop or slow it. Simply put, we're not coming home. We know that. But we're in the fight for our children and our grandchildren, and I worry about George's children. I worry about Kim Campbell's family. I worry about the children and the grandchildren of all those here today. That's the hope for me, not in the present, but in the future. So I applaud you. What more can we in this room do to help support your critical efforts? We are all ears.
I don't know that we have time for everybody to answer that question, but I would like you to go home knowing it's been asked.
Thank you.
What more can we do to help each of you? Dr. Morgan, Dr. Maslia, Dr. Bud Haberlein, and Dr. Dunn, you are our team. You represent the team, and it's got to win. So thank you on behalf of everybody.
Well, there was a lot of a fascinating conversation there to give you, in a relatively brief period of time, a complete picture of this pipeline. But with respect to tomorrow, hear what you heard. You are going in tomorrow to ask for $414 million in fiscal budget in fiscal 18. You heard exactly the guy who's going to use that money to build out what we need to do to get to 2025. You've heard the importance of diagnostics. There is a piece in the piece of legislation that is being introduced that we're asking you to talk about tomorrow that deals with diagnostics. There is a piece in the legislation that we're asking you to support that deals with paying the study partners who are required to attend these visits with the participant in the clinical trial to ease their loss of income, to pay for the transportation that it takes a family to use in order to get to a clinical trial. So we have in the legislation that you'll be talking about efforts to deal with the diagnosis, efforts to deal with some aspects of the clinical trial issue, and also support for the families. Care navigation services, which you've heard about in earlier panels, respite care, and actually a family caregiver payment. So there are things in the legislation that we're asking you to promote tomorrow, which deal with precisely these issues. They're not going to solve them. For that, Us Against Alzheimer's and working with you will engage with the primary care physicians, medical education. What are the tools they need? What are the incentives they need to have in order to increase diagnosis rates and to make it timely and accurate? There's another piece of the access question that really wasn't dealt with. So why aren't these magic imaging tools that we now know how to utilize to diagnose the disease in the hands of clinicians? Medicare won't reimburse for them right now. So what we've got is a situation for research purposes, we can diagnose people for participation in clinical trials. But if you go to your physician and you say, I want one of those PET scans that tell me whether I've got the disease, and you want me to get that PET scan, you're going to have to pay it out of pocket. Now tell me how many families in America, where we heard earlier panels saying 50% of the American people can't afford $400 for a sudden medical bill, how many are going to be able to pay for $3,000 PET scan? So until we get Medicare on board to make the reimbursement we need for both the doctor's time as well as the tools that are available and are not yet reimbursed, we still have an access problem. So each of these little barriers, and they're not little, each of these barriers on the way to innovative medicines to the market are things that your Us Against Alzheimer's team, including you, are actively engaged in part through policy tweaks, but also importantly through active engagement in the marketplace to, as I said earlier, to be the change that we're advocating for. So with that lecture, We are recording everything. So everybody up here, hopefully not everything you're doing out there. And we are going to post both a video and audio podcast of each session in the next couple of days, and we'll alert everyone who's here that they can have access to both the video and the audio of what you've heard. Now, lunch. Quickly grab a little lunch out there, bring it back. You're going to eat here. You're going to work through lunch. We're not going to make this easy for you. This is not a holiday. This is a working lunch. And we're going to hear Bill Novelli out of the keynote for lunch. So out, get your lunch, come on back in.